Hello students, we now come to the second presentation on the evolution of skyscrapers, and just to give you a recap, we talked about earlier the 1916 resolution that had come up as a response to the equitable building rising up straight up and making all the streets of New York dark below, thus to limit the height and bulk of buildings, to shape the city's vertical expansion, to assure that sunlight reached to the ground level. Came up the 1916 zoning resolution, the setback principle, so that the building as they rise up would be set back with a certain mathematical formula, and as a result of that the daylight would penetrate at the street level, and this gave rise to the wedding cake or the setback skyscrapers. Not only in America but across the globe this thing happened. Then we talked about the Art Deco, the rise of the Art Deco style and how Art Deco style impacted skyscrapers, particularly two iconic skyscrapers, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, both of them in New York. And then we had also seen the competition that rose between Chicago and New York to make the tallest buildings, and it continues till today. We also saw how architectural technology and advancements that grew out of Chicago and New York transformed skyscrapers globally. Today, skyscrapers use groundbreaking engineering techniques and groundbreaking architectural styles, and they are such tremendous pieces of architecture across the globe in different countries of the world, and some of the most complex architectural technologies we find are being used in the design and building of skyscrapers today. I also showed you last time the urban skylines and how the urban skylines are changing and how the skyscrapers dominate the urban skylines. We talked about the rise of the international style and corporate modernism, particularly the works of Mies van der Rohe, and how Mies van der Rohe propounded the dictum less is more, and how he pioneered the tall span and the long span or the large span building in glass and steel. Now, two buildings, if we talk about in the Art Deco period, we say Chrysler and the Empire State Building in New York. Then there are two other buildings that are very important with regard to the international style modernism, again in New York, and they are the Liver House by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in 1952 and the Seagram Building just across the road to the Liver House, which is by Mies van der Rohe in 1958. But truly speaking, it was Mies van der Rohe's contribution, because he had earlier done the Lakeshore Drive apartments in 1948. It was his development of the glass and steel skyscraper that also resulted in buildings like the Liver House. So though Seagram may have been completed later than Liver House, the imprint of Mies van der Rohe is evident in these skyscrapers which were made by other architects. The Seagram Building is an iconic international style skyscraper and is said to be of such superior quality that other skyscrapers that followed are measured with regard to their aesthetic quality, with regard to their presence and the dominance with the Seagram Building. It was built for the Seagram Distillery Company, 160 meters high, 38 stories tall, and generally recognized as the finest example of skyscrapers in the international style. And using his earlier palette of materials I talked about, there is steel, there is glass, there is expensive stone, there is water, and here there is certain greenery also. He used these luxurious expensive materials to make this building. Its plan was an 8.5 meter grid, but what he did was something amazing. He took the entire site and placed the skyscraper at the rear of the site and opened the entire front part of the site as a plaza, as a forecourt, which was covered in granite, paved with granite, had reflecting pools, had a low height boundary wall and had greenery around it. So there is water pools, there is this granite paved area, there is a low height wall, there is greenery, and so the plaza became a very important social activity place for the people of New York, the people of Manhattan, and it became a very lively space. This was a very unique and novel idea of Mies van der Rohe. Rather than setting back the skyscraper on the site and thus following the 1916 resolution, he completely went out of the box and just pushed the entire skyscraper to the rear of the site. This is also a very expensive decision because land was extremely costly. He literally used only about 40 to 50% of the site to cover the building, 40% of the site, and rest of it was the plaza. And by occupying 40% of the allowable zoning envelope by building on the rear of the site, as you see here, and he gave a very unique public place to the people of New York. This building has classical symmetry, as you find, for example, in the Greek temple, or you find it in the Taj Mahal. If you compare the plans, the site plan of the Taj Mahal and the site plan of the Seagram Building, you find the same strong axial symmetry in both of them. The only difference is that in the Taj Mahal, in the middle is the water body, and then there is a pathway around next to it moving towards the Taj Mahal. Here the pathway or the plaza is in the middle moving towards the building, and the water bodies are on the side. But essentially speaking, the classical symmetry is very similar in both of them. Those classical principles are very similar in both of them. Both, like I am not saying that he borrowed it from the Taj Mahal, but this is also setback like the Taj Mahal. In fact, because of this setback, it is possible to stand back on the street and look up and see the entire Seagram Building, which is usually not possible that you be able to see the entire skyscraper at one go, but because of the plaza it is possible. And the forefront has this water bodies and green areas. Now, central axial symmetry is not just with this building. There are many other skyscrapers that have followed this principle. The One World Trade Center has it, the Empire State Building had it, this building in Bahrain had it, the Petronas Towers have it. They all have central axial symmetry. With regard to the structural grid, I told you in the previous lecture also that Mies van der Rohe, using the same elements, materials, went on to perfection. He kept on building on the same principles over and over. So if you see Lakeshore Drive Apartments, followed by Seagram, followed by the Federal Center in Chicago, we find this grid in Lakeshore Drive Apartments. This grid we find in the Seagram Building, and this grid we find in the Federal Center. So much so that it might be difficult if I don't point it out to you which building is which one. They are so similar to each other. Within less than 100 years, iron in skyscrapers now was now fully exposed. Only that it was covered with this black enamel paint that Mies used to use for fireproofing purposes. Seagram Building is also unique in one more thing. It has bronze tinted glass as you would find in lacquer, and it has non-structural bronze stoned ice sections that are mounted on the building here, And then the non-structural, why the non-structural ice sections? We find them in the Lakeshore Drive Apartments, we find them in the Federal Center, we find them in AMA Plaza, we find them in the Seagram Building. Repeatedly, Mies van der Rohe uses these non-structural ice sections that are not carrying any load. They are only there to relieve the monotony of the glass facade and to accentuate the verticality. If you remember my lecture on Louis Sullivan, I told you in the Wainwright Building, when he made those vertical members, only alternate vertical members were load bearing and the alternate were non-load bearing. So why did he add those non-load bearing vertical members? To accentuate, emphasize the verticality of the building, because he had said the tall building by all means it should look tall. And so by providing these series of ice section, a non-structural ice section in his buildings, he accentuates the height or the verticality of the building. So thus in a sense, this is an ornamentation in Mies's buildings, is what purists criticize him for. In the Seagram interiors, we find free flowing space on a typical floor plan, which is coming straight from the earlier development of skyscrapers in the Chicago school. Now, when we look at the Liver House just across the street, done by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Gordon Bunshaft was their architect, it is 94 meters tall. It's also set back. It's like a slab block set back on the side, but instead of having a plaza, it has this low height building, this low height building that is built all over the site, and then the glass block is mounted at the rear. And this is also built in the international style. The second curtain wall skyscraper in New York City after the United Nations Secretariat building that came up was the Liver House. Now, the tower is set back as happened in Seagram, but it has this 2-story high horizontal block which has got an open courtyard in the middle occupying the entire site, and the tower is 21-storied high, located on the north of the site. Now, this entire plaza, this entire courtyard within just opens up the building at the ground level, and but the entrance to the slab block is kept away from the pedestrian street. You have to go via this open courtyard to the entrance. Now, the same concept of having a low lying block all across the site and then the slab block at the edge or the end of the site, we find in other skyscrapers that came up at the time, like it came up in the UN building, it came up in the MX Business Center in Ankara, and it came up in the Europa Center in Berlin in 1965. And not so this low rise building with the slab block at one end. We see that in several buildings in India also this happened. So the typical floor plan of the Liver House, it was a very different kind of design. This is the working space, and the facilities, the elevators and the washroom, etc., are provided on one side of the slab block, and you can see how open and free flowing the plan is. Now, this is a picture that shows you how the 20th century glass and steel city actually looks like today. Because of this complete exposure of glass and steel, we've got these sleek buildings all around Liver House in Manhattan, and this is how that area looks like today. By mid-century, most new international style buildings had met the setback requirements by adopting the use of plazas and low-rise buildings surrounding a slab block at one end of the site. So now the 1916 resolutions zoning, the purpose of that zoning was being violated because, not because of these buildings, but because other buildings, though they were giving setbacks, but they were massive skyscrapers like the Empire State Building, because there was no law on how much can be built. There was abundance of setback skyscrapers, but even then, because of their mass, because of how big they were dense and monotonous streetscapes as a result of that. The added problem was there was automobile congestion happening in cities because of so many tall buildings coming up, and thus there was a need to control the overall buildable area of the building. The two buildings, Seagram Building and the Liver House, actually showed to the New Yorkers a new concept, a new way of putting up a skyscraper that would give some freedom at the ground level and leave some urban open space for the public. And we find this happening globally, like I just mentioned. I showed you this image earlier, and even in India, there are these buildings, the Air India building, the Indian Express building, the Hotel Meridian, or the Stock Exchange Board building in Mumbai. All of them have this slab block at one end, and the entire site is covered with a low height building. Now, I have just now described the plaza of the Seagram building, and this became a very important backdrop for the 1961 zoning resolution. Very easy to remember, 1916 and the reverse of 1661. 1916 zoning resolution led to the setback skyscrapers, and then came the 1961 zoning resolution. What was it? It was about defining what came to be commonly known today as FAR, floor area ratio, and that is that the floor area ratio is the gross floor area of the building divided by the area of the plot on which it is sited. The gross floor area of the building divided by the site area, and this was to replace the setback rules, because as a result of this, the building's height could be limited now, the building's bulk could be limited now, because it was now predicated to the site or the site area on which the building had been erected. So if this was the consequence of the 1916 zoning resolution, this was the kind of skyscrapers that came up because of the 1961 zoning resolution. FAR defined how much could be built, and the developer could use the FAR on the site as he desired. There was no limitation on how he should use the FAR. He could do it like the Seagram Building. He could leave a large part of the site empty and just erect a tall building, or he could have different ways of utilizing the FAR. But the important part was incentives for open spaces. If a particular client provided open spaces in his skyscraper, in his building, around the building, then bonus FAR was to be provided to him. So if let us take the example of the Continental Center in New York in 1983, and this feature that you see at the base of the skyscraper has given rise to this internal open public space. And because the client or the builders were very interested to build more FAR, this bonus FAR was an incentive for them, and thus they started providing plazas and other public spaces at the street level, and it became a win-win situation for everybody. The bonus FAR encouraged the modernist sheer slab-like tower in an open plaza. For example, the General Motors building by E.D. Stone, Edward Durrell Stone in 1968, and he provided a plaza here, or the Paramount Plaza by Emery Roth and Sons in 1968. He's also provided a plaza similar to the Seagram Building here. So this in these buildings, bonus FAR was provided so that they could build more area in their buildings. This also, like the setback skyscraper, was responsible for defining the shape of the skyscraper. This 61 resolution also helped in defining the new shape of the skyscraper. Another important provision was the ability to sell and transfer unused FAR to the adjacent property. If there is FAR which I have not utilized fully in my building, I can sell it to an adjoining building. Later on, the concept of air rights also came in New York, and they are applicable today, that there are the air above my building, there are certain rights I have over that, and if I am not building my building all the way to fully utilize my air rights, even those air rights can be sold to an adjoining property so they can build higher. And you can hear about this concept. You can go online to read more about air rights, and these are being used in the current skyscrapers in Manhattan, in New York, in that area. So we find that this bonus FAR, like for example, this is what happens with the bonus FAR, that the floor area can be increased by up to 20% by providing a plaza open to the public. And when we add public plazas, we can have visual or performing art spaces, or make improvements to the subway entrance, or for preserving theatres. Whatever the builder might do that gives benefit to the public, then the government gives benefit to the builder in terms of bonus FAR. The Seagram and Liverhouse introduced this concept, and this came to be known as privately owned public spaces, or POPs. Privately owned public spaces, or POPs. And it was a win-win situation because the public could get the kind of public spaces that they needed, the builder could get the bonus FAR that he needed, and both were the winners in this thing. So for example, if you take the AT&T building by Philip Johnson, now called the 550 Madison Avenue, it has got this sleek classical facade. It's 195 meters tall, and it has got a publicly accessible space at the ground level that can be used by the public. It's a POPs, it's a privately owned public space for the public. Now coming to the skyscraper itself, this is different from the glass and steel skyscraper because this is built on the style called postmodernism. We will talk about this when I talk to you about styles and movements. This skyscraper has a base, a shaft and a capital like a classical building, and Not only that, there is a broken pediment provided at the top of the building, a notch provided here, like you find this broken pediment here or like here, and this was to clearly identify the building in the midst of a large number of skyscrapers. You see, in the sea of skyscrapers, how do you identify that this is this particular company's skyscraper? The unique selling point is the pinnacle of the skyscraper, and thus all the skyscrapers around are having similar functions, similar structures, similar building systems, even similar bylaws. Only by the external form, external envelope, or by the pinnacle of the building can I identify the building. Another thing I would like to point out, and we'll talk more about it when I talk about styles and movements, is that though this building may look very different from a glass and steel skyscraper, exposed glass and steel skyscraper, essentially it is the same, because the same systems and the same technology goes into this building also. The outer wall of the building in this also is non-load bearing curtain walling. It's only been provided this classical looking facade or historical facade on the outside. It's only a facade. The building is as modern as any glass and steel building. And so comes the concept of the idea of style in skyscrapers. We'll talk more about that later. Now, more regulations followed in 1982 with regard to the utilization of or provision of public areas and the way the streets ought to be and what kind of installations for public interest ought to be provided. Now, few things that happened because of 1982 resolution is plazas like that of Seagram were no longer approved to preserve the unbroken continuity of the avenue walls at the street level. The buildings must extend as far as the development limit, and this is required. They are also required to incorporate subway station entrances. The covered squares, inner courtyards, passages, etc. bring bonus in terms of site use, so much so that if all the options available in the bylaws are utilized by a builder or a client, he can build up to 22 times the surface area of the property. He can get that much amount of bonus in building the site, that he can build up to 22 times the site of the building, and at the same time providing privately operated, privately owned public spaces for the advantage of the public. All these, when I talk to you about the zoning laws of 16 or 61 or 82, what is the importance of this? Why do we need to know about this? We need to know so that we understand why the skyscrapers have taken the shape and form that they have taken. There have been other issues connected with how daylight penetrates at the street level and how congestion can be removed, how public spaces need to be provided. That has given rise to the kind of form we see in skyscrapers in our times. Another thing that is very important, which has resulted in the form of skyscrapers, is the structural technology involved, and I will be talking to you about that in a later presentation and what forms a very important basis of skyscraper design. So, this is another example of a publicly operated, privately owned public space, and contemporary skyscrapers with POPs. The examples are, for example, the Beau in Canada by Foster and Partners in 2012. It's got a large open plaza and an enclosed garden atrium. Or we have the Lot World Tower in Seoul in South Korea, which has got a rooftop garden, observation decks and public plazas, which are also aligning with Seoul's zoning laws when it comes to open spaces in high-rise buildings. So, we see that Seoul's zoning laws align with the zoning laws that came up in New York. Or we have this Roppongi Hills Mori Tower in Tokyo by Kohn Pedersen and Fox, and this got a public art museum, landscape gardens and plazas. Here again, Tokyo's urban design principles align with mixed use development and cultural integration, again somewhat akin to what were the zoning laws that came up in New York. Or the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore by Moshe Sabdi has several public utility spaces. Or the Shard in London has public spaces. Thus we find that how the skyscrapers have evolved in the modern times, particularly as a result of zoning laws and regulations imposed on them, constraints have not resulted in damaging the idea of the skyscraper, but in fact has enhanced the kind of skyscrapers we have in front of us. The design of the skyscrapers, the constraints imposed by zoning laws have resulted in architects designing amazing pieces of architecture in the form of skyscrapers. Then we'll go on from here to look at some more examples of skyscrapers and how they came up. We'll look at bioclimatic skyscrapers, we'll look at energy efficiency in skyscrapers, seismic safety in skyscrapers, how they resulted in the kind of skyscrapers that came up, and we will wrap it up by talking about the contribution of structural technology in shaping the form of the modern skyscraper. Thank you.